My name is Camilla Farley. I am 26 years old. 10 years ago, my mother threw my clothes onto the wet grass of our front lawn and told me I was dead to them. My father changed the locks on the front door while I stood shivering in the dark. My older sister watched the entire scene unfold from an upstairs window. She smiled and gave me a little wave goodbye. I was 16 years old. I was terrified. And I was pregnant. For 10 years, I did not receive a single phone call, not a birthday card, not a text message. I was erased from the family tree. Last Tuesday, I pulled into that exact same driveway in a $130,000 Porsche Panamera. I stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a tailored designer suit. The contrast felt surreal. My pristine car sitting on their cracked, weed-choked concrete. I walked up the steps past the old porch swing hanging by a single rusted chain. I rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door, holding a ceramic coffee mug. When she looked up and recognized the daughter she threw away standing on her porch, holding the legal deed to her home, the mug slipped right through her fingers. It shattered on the concrete porch. Her knees physically buckled. She could not even stay standing. Before I tell you what I pulled out of my briefcase next, I want to welcome you to Sophia Told Stories. If you have ever had to build your own life from scratch because toxic family members tried to tear you down, please take a second to hit that like and subscribe button. Also, drop your exact age in the comments below. I always love seeing the different generations tuning in. Now let me take you back a decade. Let me show you exactly how a pregnant 16-year-old girl went from sleeping in a diner booth to holding the keys to her parents' ruined kingdom. To understand the ultimate betrayal, you have to understand the strict hierarchy of my childhood home in suburban Ohio. There were two daughters in the Farley house, but only one of them mattered. I was the quiet one, the one who earned perfect grades and stayed out of the way. My sister Payton was the golden child. Payton was 19. She was a charismatic cheerleader who commanded the center of attention in every room she ever entered. My parents, Richard and Susan, worshipped the ground she walked on. They ignored every red flag she ever waved. I learned early on that my specific role was to be invisible while Payton performed. I ghostwrote her college application essays so she could look smart. I quietly ironed her expensive dresses for parties I was never allowed to attend. I kept my head down. I thought keeping the peace would keep me safe. I was so incredibly wrong. The illusion began to crack one rainy afternoon when I brought the mail inside. I noticed a bank statement addressed to my parents that had been torn open. I looked at the pages. Payton had maxed out 3 secret credit cards in our parents' names. She had buried herself in debt and hid the evidence for months. When I confronted her in her bedroom, she did not apologize. She backed me into the corner of her room. Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper. She told me if I ever breathed a word to our parents, she would ruin my life. I stared at the floor and promised to keep quiet. I thought I was protecting myself. I did not realize I had just given her a reason to eliminate me. And when my own crisis hit a few months later, Payton did not hesitate to pull the trigger. Let me paint a picture of the Farley household. 10 years ago, I was a sophomore in high school. My sister Payton was a 19-year-old college freshman who still lived at home. She drove a pristine white sedan my father leased for her. I took the public bus. Our parents, Richard and Susan, operated under a very specific belief system. In their eyes, Payton was a masterpiece. She was a varsity cheerleader with bright blonde hair and a smile that could talk any traffic cop out of a speeding ticket. She was loud. She was magnetic. She required constant applause. I was the exact opposite. I was 15 years old. I read paperback novels in the corner of the living room while my family watched television. I earned straight A's in advanced placement classes. My reward was a brief nod from my father before he turned his attention back to whatever story Payton was telling. There's a distinct difference between being ignored and being used as a prop. I was a prop. I remember a Friday night in late October. Payton had a college fraternity formal to attend. My mother had purchased her a stunning emerald green silk dress. It cost more than my entire back-to-school wardrobe. The silk was delicate and prone to wrinkling. Susan did not want to risk ruining the fabric with a cheap iron. Payton claimed she did not know how to use the heat settings. So the task fell to me. I stood in our cramped laundry room for 45 minutes. The hot steam curled up against my face. I carefully pressed every single inch of that expensive fabric. I made sure the garment was flawless. While I worked, I could hear my family in the kitchen. My father was laughing at Payton's jokes. My mother was fixing her hair. When I brought the dress out on a velvet hanger, no one said thank you. Payton simply snatched the silk from my hands and complained that it took too long. I went back to my bedroom and closed the door. My servitude went far beyond household chores. I was also Payton's personal ghostwriter. Despite her popularity, Payton possessed terrible study habits. She barely scraped by with low grades. When it came time for her to apply to local universities, she panicked. She stared at a blank screen for 2 days before Susan marched into my room and told me to help my sister. Help meant doing the actual work. I sat at her desk and typed out her personal statements. The essay prompt asked the applicant to describe a time they overcame profound adversity. Payton had never faced a single profound hardship in her entire life. Every obstacle she ever encountered had been paved over by Richard's wallet or Susan's interference. So I invented a struggle for her. I crafted a deeply moving narrative about her overcoming a sprained ankle during a cheerleading championship. I used advanced vocabulary. I structured the emotional arc perfectly. It felt like theft, but I hit submit anyway. The essay won her a spot at the state university. My parents framed her acceptance letter. They hung it in the hallway. I walked past my own stolen words every single morning. I thought keeping my head down and doing what was asked would keep the peace. I assumed if I stayed invisible, I would stay safe. But invisibility only works if you do not see things you are not supposed to see. That illusion shattered on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was the first one home from school. I walked up the driveway and grabbed the mail from our metal box. A thick white envelope caught my eye. It looked official. It bore the logo of a major national bank. The flap was already half torn open. It must have caught on the sharp hinge of the mailbox door. I did not mean to snoop. I merely pulled the papers out to slide them back in evenly. As I did, my eyes caught a sequence of numbers that made my blood run cold. It was a credit card statement. The primary account holder name printed at the top was Richard Farley, but the secondary authorized user was Payton. I knew my father managed his finances with intense scrutiny. He balanced his checkbook every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. He never carried a balance. He hated debt. Yet the paper in my trembling hands showed a balance owed of $14,000. I scanned the itemized charges. They were not for tuition or textbooks. The list read like a luxury shopping spree: $600 at a high-end cosmetics store, $1,200 for a designer handbag, $3,000 for a weekend resort stay in Miami. Payton was bleeding our parents dry. She had secretly opened secondary cards attached to their home equity lines. She was living a fake, lavish lifestyle and charging it all to the very people who worshipped her. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew this discovery was a ticking time bomb. Richard would eventually notice the missing funds. When he did, the fallout would tear the house apart. I thought I was doing the right thing by going to Payton first. I thought giving her a chance to confess would soften the blow. I walked up the stairs to her bedroom. I knocked once and pushed the door open. Payton was sitting on her plush rug, painting her toenails. She looked up, annoyed by the interruption. I did not say a word. I just dropped the crumpled bank statement onto her lap. I expected her to panic. I expected tears. I expected her to beg me for help. Instead, she set her nail polish brush down with terrifying calm. She picked up the paper and glanced at the numbers. Her face did not flush with guilt. Her eyes went flat and cold. She stood up and closed the distance between us. Payton was taller than me. She used that height to box me into the doorframe. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, the same perfume she had charged to our father's account. "You are going to turn around and walk out of this room," Payton whispered. Her voice lacked any trace of the bubbly cheerleader persona she wore downstairs. It was sharp and venomous. I shook my head. I told her Dad was going to find out. I told her she was stealing from them. Payton let out a dry, hollow laugh. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her fingernails dug into my skin. "If you say one single word to them about this, I will destroy you," she said. Her tone was steady. She was not making an empty threat. She was making a promise. "I will tell them you forged the documents. I will tell them you stole the card from his wallet. I will tell them you bought all those things and hid them. Who do you think they will believe? Camilla, the quiet, weird girl who hides in her room, or the daughter they actually love?" The question hit me like a physical blow. The tragedy was that I already knew the answer. Richard and Susan would never believe their golden child was capable of such deception. If Payton pointed the finger at me, they would accept her lie without hesitation. They needed Payton to be perfect. My innocence would just be an inconvenient obstacle to their preferred reality. I looked at the bank statement in her hand. Then I looked at her cold, calculating eyes. I pulled my wrist free from her grip. I stepped backward out of her room. I told her I would not say anything. I surrendered. Payton smiled. It was the exact same chilling smile she would give me months later from the upstairs window as I stood freezing on the lawn. She closed her bedroom door in my face. I walked back to my room carrying a heavy, suffocating dread. I had chosen silence to protect my fragile peace. I thought sweeping her sins under the rug would keep the family intact. I did not realize I had just handed her a loaded weapon. By letting her get away with the credit card fraud, I taught Payton that there were zero consequences for her actions. I taught her she could manipulate any situation to her advantage. I gave her the confidence to plan an even bigger theft. She knew she had a perfect scapegoat waiting in the wings. All she needed was the right distraction. A few months later, I provided her with the ultimate smokescreen. I missed my period. My hands shook as I stared at 2 pink lines on a plastic test. I was terrified. I was desperate. And in my blind panic, I made the fatal mistake of going to the very person who had already promised to ruin my life. The linoleum floor of the upstairs bathroom felt like ice against my bare legs. I sat there for 2 hours, staring at a plastic stick. 2 pink lines. At 16 years old, those 2 lines are not a medical result. They are a death sentence to your youth. My hands shook so hard, I dropped the test into the sink twice. I grabbed my phone and texted the boy I had been seeing. His name was Tyler. He was a junior who played junior varsity lacrosse and drove his older brother's hand-me-down sedan. We were not in love. We were just 2 bored teenagers in a quiet Ohio suburb making terrible, careless decisions. I typed the words out. I am pregnant. I hit send. I watched the tiny gray letters switch to read. Then I watched the typing bubble appear. It hovered for 10 seconds. Then it vanished. I tried to call him. The automated voice told me the number was no longer in service. Tyler had blocked me across every single platform. He erased himself from the equation in less than a minute. I was entirely alone. Panic is a physical sensation. It starts in your throat and slowly suffocates your lungs. I could hear my father downstairs talking loudly on a business call. I could hear my mother running the vacuum cleaner in the hallway. Richard and Susan Farley did not tolerate imperfection. A teenage pregnancy in their pristine household would be treated like a toxic spill. I knew I could not face them alone. I needed an ally. I needed someone who knew how to navigate their tempers and soften their judgments. I needed the one person they actually listened to. I walked down the hall and stood outside Payton's bedroom door. It had been 4 months since I caught her hiding that $14,000 credit card bill. We had barely spoken since that afternoon. We lived like polite strangers under the same roof, but desperation makes you forget your own boundaries. I knocked twice and pushed the door open. Payton was sitting at her vanity mirror, applying lip gloss. She sighed and asked what I wanted. I did not have the energy to build up to the reveal. I just blurted it out. I told her I was pregnant and Tyler had abandoned me. I braced myself for her disgust. I expected her to mock me or yell. Instead, something terrifying happened. Payton set her lip gloss down. She turned around and looked at me with an expression of profound, calculating focus. The annoyance melted off her face. She stood up and walked over to me. She wrapped her arms around my shaking shoulders and pulled me into a tight hug. She stroked my hair. She told me everything was going to be fine. She whispered that she would protect me. She promised she would talk to Mom and Dad first to prepare them so they would not be angry when I came downstairs. I cried into her shoulder. I felt a fleeting sense of gratitude. I thought my older sister had finally stepped up to save me. I was young and naive. I did not realize I had just walked into a trap. I did not know that Payton was not hugging a scared younger sister. She was embracing her own salvation. To understand the depth of Payton's betrayal, you have to understand the financial quicksand she was drowning in. That $14,000 credit card bill, GDK card bill, tip of the iceberg. Payton had a shopping addiction and a desperate need GDK him maintain her status among her wealthy college friends. When the credit cards maxed out, she found a new source of capital. Our parents possessed a home equity line of credit. Richard kept the account open for emergency home repairs. He kept the blank checks in an unlocked filing cabinet in his home office. Payton had stolen a book of those checks. Over the course of 3 months, she forged our father's signature and drained $40,000 from the equity of our childhood home. She used the cash to rent VIP tables at downtown clubs. She bought designer clothes she wore once and discarded. She paid for expensive weekend trips for her sorority sisters to ensure they kept treating her like royalty. But the fun was reaching its inevitable end. The bank had just mailed a quarterly statement detailing the severe withdrawal. Payton knew Richard would open that specific envelope. She knew the moment he saw the $40,000 deficit, her life of luxury would end. She would face criminal fraud charges. She needed a distraction. She needed a scapegoat capable of committing a shocking, unforgivable crime. When I walked into her room and confessed my pregnancy, I handed her the exact weapon she needed. A pregnant, desperate teenager is the perfect suspect for a missing $40,000. Payton told me to wait in my bedroom. She told me to pack a small bag with a few days' worth of clothes, just in case our parents needed space to cool off. She said she would go downstairs, break the news gently, and text me when it was safe to come down. I followed her instructions blindly. I stuffed some jeans and sweaters into a duffel bag. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching my phone, waiting for her signal. Downstairs, Payton was executing an Oscar-worthy performance. I would learn the details of this conversation years later through the bitter admissions of my own mother. Payton walked into the kitchen where Richard and Susan were drinking coffee. She forced herself to hyperventilate. She squeezed out real tears. She collapsed into a dining chair and buried her face in her hands. When our parents rushed over to comfort her, Payton spun a web of lies so intricate and devastating, it permanently rewrote my existence. She did not just tell them I was pregnant. She told them I was spiraling out of control. She claimed she had caught me using hard, illicit drugs in the school parking lot. She told them Tyler was not just a boy, but a dangerous dealer, forcing me to use. Then she delivered the killing strike. Payton wept as she confessed a terrible secret she claimed she had been hiding to protect me. She told Richard to check his home equity account. She sobbed as she explained that I had stolen the checks, forged his signature, and drained $40,000. According to Payton, I was planning to use the stolen money to run away with Tyler to another state and feed our supposed drug habits. Payton took a terrified, vulnerable 16-year-old girl and transformed her into a thieving, drug-addicted runaway. She handed our parents a narrative that demanded immediate, ruthless action. Richard and Susan did not pause to question the logic. They did not wonder how a sophomore taking advanced placement history managed to orchestrate high-level bank fraud. They did not look for evidence. They only saw their perfect crying eldest daughter trying to save the family from the monster upstairs. My phone vibrated on my bedspread. It was a text from Payton. It read, "Come downstairs, they know." I took a deep breath. I slung my duffel bag over my shoulder. I walked out of my bedroom and headed toward the staircase. I thought I was walking into a difficult intervention. I thought there would be tears and grounding and maybe a forced transfer to a new high school. I descended the carpeted steps slowly. My heart pounded against my ribs. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner into the kitchen. Richard and Susan were waiting for me. Payton stood directly behind them. The supportive sister who had hugged me 20 minutes ago was gone. In her place was a silent spectator, watching the execution she had just ordered. I looked at my father's face. I expected to see disappointment. I expected to see worry. Instead, I saw pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who had broken into his home to do them harm. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. The trap had closed. The trial was already over, and the sentencing was about to begin. I stepped onto the cold kitchen tile. The silence in the room felt thick enough to choke on. My canvas duffel bag hung heavy against my hip. Richard stood behind the sprawling granite island. His posture was rigid. His jaw muscle twitched. Susan stood beside him. Her arms were tightly folded across her chest. Her lips were pressed into a thin, white line. I waited for one of them to mention the baby. I waited for my mother to ask if I had seen a doctor. I waited for my father to express some shred of concern for my physical well-being. Neither of them looked at my stomach. Their eyes remained fixed on my face with an icy, unyielding glare. Richard broke the silence. His voice did not hold a single ounce of paternal warmth. It sounded like a judge handing down a prison sentence. He asked me where I hid the cash. I blinked. My mind struggled to process his question. I asked him what he meant. My father slammed his open palm against the polished marble countertop. The sharp crack echoed through the high ceilings. He told me to stop playing dumb. He demanded the $40,000. He commanded me to hand over the funds before he called the local police. My breath caught in my throat. I shook my head back and forth. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring my vision. I swore I had no idea what he was talking about. I told them I did not take a single dime. Susan took a step forward. Her gaze was sharp and unforgiving. She told me to drop the innocent victim routine. She claimed they knew everything about my secret life. She accused me of harboring a severe substance abuse problem. She said I planned to drain their home equity account so I could run away with a teenage drug dealer. The narrative was so bizarre and twisted, I could barely comprehend the words leaving her mouth. From the shadows near the walk-in pantry, Payton emerged. My older sister executed her performance with flawless precision. She held a thick stack of printer paper in her manicured hands. She let out a trembling sigh. She wiped a carefully manufactured tear from her cheek. Payton walked over to the kitchen island and gently placed the documents in front of our father. Payton whispered that she was heartbroken. She told our parents she hated having to expose me. She claimed she went onto my desktop computer to borrow a charging cable and stumbled across the browser history. I leaned forward to look at the papers. They were printed bank transfer confirmations. The digital logs showed $40,000 routed from my father's equity line into an offshore routing number. The IP address printed at the bottom of the page matched my personal bedroom computer. The trap clamped shut around my ankle. Payton had spent the last 3 months sneaking into my room while I was at school. She used my desktop to commit her financial crimes. She planted the digital footprint directly onto my machine. She engineered the perfect frame job. Panic flooded my veins. I pointed a shaking finger at my sister. I raised my voice and called her a liar. I pleaded with my parents to remember the $14,000 credit card bill Payton had hidden just a few months prior. I tried to explain her shopping addiction. I tried to tell them she was drowning in debt and using me to cover her tracks. Susan slapped her hand down on the papers. She ordered me to stop defaming her eldest daughter. She called my accusations a pathetic attempt to shift the blame. I shoved my hand into my denim pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I begged them to look at the screen. I told them to read my text messages. I wanted them to see that Tyler had blocked my number. I needed them to realize there was no grand escape plan. I was just a terrified pregnant teenager who needed her family. Richard stepped around the island. He swatted the phone out of my grip. The device hit the floor and skidded across the linoleum beneath the refrigerator. He told me he was done listening to my poison. He stated I had disgraced their pristine reputation. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm. His grip felt like a steel vise. He pulled me toward the front foyer. I dug my sneakers into the hardwood floor, attempting to slow his momentum. My duffel bag bumped awkwardly against my side. I sobbed uncontrollably. I cried out for my mother. I begged Susan to intervene. I pleaded with her to look at the facts. Susan followed us into the entryway. She walked with slow, deliberate steps. She reached out and turned the brass handle of the heavy oak front door. She pulled it open. A freezing October storm was raging outside. Wind whipped through the threshold, carrying a spray of freezing rain onto the interior welcome mat. The sky was pitch black. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Richard dragged me to the edge of the porch. He shoved me forward. I stumbled down the concrete steps. I lost my footing and collapsed onto the soaked grass. My canvas bag landed in a puddle next to me. The cold water instantly seeped through the fabric of my thin sweater. I scrambled to my knees. I looked up at the doorway. Richard stood tall and unbothered. Susan stepped out beside him. She looked down at me with an expression devoid of any maternal instinct. She did not see a vulnerable child. She only saw a liability. Susan delivered a sentence that would echo in my mind for the next decade. She looked me dead in the eyes and stated that I was dead to them. She stepped back inside. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound was deafening. I heard the brass deadbolt slide into place. I heard the security chain rattle as it locked. I was officially locked out of my own life. The rain poured down in relentless sheets. My hair plastered to my cheeks. My teeth began to chatter. I wrapped both of my arms tightly around my waist. I shielded the tiny, fragile life growing inside my stomach. I knelt there in the dark, waiting for them to realize their mistake. I waited for the porch light to flick back on. I waited for the door to open. It remained firmly shut. A gust of wind tore through the neighborhood, bending the branches of the old oak tree in our front yard. I slowly tilted my head back. I wiped the freezing rain from my eyelashes. I looked up at the brick facade of my childhood home. A warm yellow glow illuminated the second-story window. It was Payton's bedroom. My sister stood right behind the glass. Her posture was entirely relaxed. Her arms were folded casually across her chest. The devastated, heartbroken sibling routine had vanished into thin air. Her face held a look of pure triumph. A slow, chilling smile stretched across her lips. She looked down at me, shivering in the mud. She raised her right hand. She offered a delicate, mocking little wave goodbye. Then she reached up and pulled the blinds shut. The light disappeared. I was erased. I realized in that exact moment that nobody was coming to save me. My parents had chosen their beautiful illusion over my ugly truth. I picked up my soaking wet duffel bag. I dragged myself to my feet. I had less than $20 in my pocket. I had no car. I had no phone. I had nowhere to sleep. The temperature was dropping rapidly. I began walking down the dark suburban sidewalk. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, lonely shadows on the pavement. I did not know how I was going to survive the night. I just knew I had to keep moving. I headed toward the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour diner at the edge of town. I had no idea that my fight for survival was just beginning. I had no idea that a severe medical emergency in a high school hallway would soon introduce me to the only real mother figure I would ever know. The first 7 nights of my exile were spent in the back corner booth of a 24-hour diner located just off the interstate. I nursed a single cup of black coffee for hours until the graveyard shift waitress took pity on me and stopped bringing the check. I curled my legs underneath my damp coat and tried to sleep while the neon open sign buzzed above my head. When the sun came up, I walked 2 miles to a local gas station. I locked myself inside the cramped restroom. I used rough paper towels and freezing tap water to wash my face and scrub the dirt from my hands. I stared at my reflection in the scratched mirror. I looked pale and hollow. I tried to smooth down my wrinkled clothes to maintain the illusion of a normal high school student. I was 16. I was carrying a child, and my daily reality had shrunk to the basic mechanics of finding a warm place to sit and a safe place to hide. I continued to attend my classes. I thought keeping my attendance record flawless would somehow protect me from the chaos swallowing my life. I walked through the crowded hallways of my high school, carrying my heavy backpack. Every locker slam and echoing laugh felt disconnected from my new reality. My classmates worried about upcoming dances and weekend parties. I worried about how long human beings could survive on leftover dinner rolls and tap water. I sat in the back row of my advanced placement courses, taking meticulous notes, while my stomach cramped with a sharp, persistent ache. I wore oversized hoodies to conceal my changing body. I avoided eye contact. I pushed my physical limits past the point of endurance because I believed asking for help meant admitting defeat. I did not realize my body was quietly keeping a strict accounting of the trauma. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning between second and third period. I was walking down the main corridor toward the science wing. The fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker and blur. A loud ringing noise filled my ears, drowning out the chatter of hundreds of students. I tried to lean against the cold metal surface of a locker to steady myself, but my knees buckled. The floor rushed up to meet me. Darkness swallowed my vision before I even felt the impact. I woke up to the sharp clinical smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile bandages. I was lying on a stiff vinyl cot in the school nurse's office. A blood pressure cuff squeezed my upper arm. The nurse was a stern woman with a clipboard standing at the foot of the bed. She looked down at me with an expression of deep suspicion. She informed me I had collapsed from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. Then she delivered a sentence that made my blood turn to ice. She said she had examined me while I was unconscious. She knew I was pregnant. She stated she was legally obligated to contact Child Protective Services because I was a minor in a state of obvious neglect. Pure terror gripped my chest. Child Protective Services meant foster care. It meant losing my baby to the state the moment she was born. It meant my parents might be contacted and forced to take custody of a child they already despised. I sat up too fast. The room spun wildly. I begged the nurse to put the phone down. I pleaded with her to let me leave. I promised I would eat. I swore I was fine. The nurse just shook her head and reached for the receiver on her desk. My fight for survival was about to end in a bureaucratic nightmare. Then the office door swung open. Mrs. Gallagher walked in. She was my advanced placement economics teacher. She was a woman in her late 50s who wore structured blazers and commanded respect through sheer, intimidating competence. She never smiled. She never handed out easy grades. She expected excellence and accepted 0 excuses. She stepped between the nurse and the telephone. Mrs. Gallagher possessed a voice that did not ask for permission. She instructed the nurse to wait outside. The nurse hesitated, but Mrs. Gallagher simply pointed a rigid finger toward the hallway. The door clicked shut, leaving the 2 of us alone in the small room. Mrs. Gallagher pulled up a metal chair and sat beside my cot. She did not offer me pity. She did not offer me a warm hug or empty platitudes. She looked at me with sharp, discerning eyes and asked me a series of rapid-fire questions. Where are your parents? Why are you starving? How far along is the pregnancy? I looked at her steady, unblinking gaze, and the dam finally broke. I told her everything. I explained the stolen $40,000. I detailed my sister's elaborate frame job. I described the rain, the changed locks, and the diner booth. I laid out the entire ruined architecture of my life. She listened in total silence until I finished speaking. Then she stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from her blazer. She told me I was not going into the foster system. She stated I was coming home with her. Mrs. Gallagher lived alone in a modest brick house near the edge of the school district. She had a spare bedroom that smelled like old books and cedar wood. That afternoon, she drove me to her house and handed me a set of keys. She told me the rules were simple. I would eat 3 meals a day, I would finish my high school education, and I would learn how to fight back using the law. The conflict shifted from dodging the elements to navigating the legal system. Mrs. Gallagher became the fierce advocate I never had. She hired a family law attorney using her own savings. We filed a petition for state emancipation. We had to prove to a judge that my biological parents had abandoned me and that I was capable of managing my own affairs. Mrs. Gallagher secured me a part-time job filing paperwork at a local accounting firm. She drove me to the county courthouse, where I stood before a magistrate and legally severed my ties to Richard and Susan. The judge signed the decree. I walked out of those heavy wooden doors as an emancipated minor. I was 16 years old and legally recognized as an adult. For the next few months, I experienced a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace. Mrs. Gallagher drove me to every prenatal appointment. She sat in the waiting room while the doctors measured my progress. She helped me set up a crib in the corner of her spare room. I focused entirely on graduating and preparing for motherhood. When my daughter Mia was born, she arrived healthy and perfect. I held her tiny, fragile body against my chest in the hospital delivery room. Mrs. Gallagher stood by my side, holding a small pink blanket. I looked down at my newborn daughter and made a silent vow. I promised Mia she would never know the sting of betrayal. I promised I would build a fortress around her that no one could ever breach. I thought the worst was behind me. I believed my sister and my parents were ghosts from a previous life safely locked away in the past. But toxic people rarely leave clean exits. 2 weeks after I brought Mia home, the mail carrier delivered a thick yellow envelope addressed to me. It bore the return address of a national collections agency. I sat at Mrs. Gallagher's kitchen table and tore the flap open. I assumed it was a medical bill from the hospital. I pulled out the crisp white pages and scanned the text. The document was a final notice of default. The balance owed was $9,000, but the account listed was not a hospital bill. It was a high-interest retail credit card. I read the date the account was opened. It was authorized 3 months before I was kicked out of my parents' house. I looked at the signature line on the attached documentation. It was my name, written in a handwriting I recognized instantly. The sweeping loops and sharp angles belonged to Payton. My sister did not just use me as a scapegoat for her $40,000 theft. She had meticulously stolen my Social Security number from our father's filing cabinet. She had opened a fraudulent line of credit in my name while I was still living under their roof. She maxed out the card and abandoned the payments. I was 17 years old. I was a new mother, trying to rent an apartment and secure student loans for college, and Payton had quietly destroyed my credit score from afar. She reached out from her comfortable bedroom and set fire to my financial future. The peace I had built with Mrs. Gallagher evaporated in an instant. I realized then that escaping my family was not enough. I had to become immune to them. And to do that, I needed to learn exactly how money and power truly worked. I stared at the collection notice sitting on the kitchen table. I did not cry. The tears had dried up weeks ago during those long nights sleeping in the diner booth. Instead, a cold, metallic taste flooded my mouth. It was fury. Pure distilled rage. Payton had not just pushed me out of the house to save herself. She had reached across city lines to chain me to poverty. She had stolen my identity to ensure I could never rent an apartment, buy a car, or secure a basic loan. She wanted me crippled. She wanted to guarantee that her lie remained safe because a destitute teenage mother would never possess the resources to challenge her narrative. I looked over at the corner of the room. Mia was sleeping soundly in a second-hand wooden crib Mrs. Gallagher had found at a local charity shop. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. She was so small and entirely dependent on me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Surviving was no longer enough. Scraping by on the margins of society would leave us vulnerable to predators like my sister. If I wanted to protect my daughter, I needed to build a fortress. That fortress could not be made of brick or good intentions. It had to be constructed from leverage. I needed to acquire the one thing my family respected. I needed wealth. I needed power. That night defined the rest of my life. It was 3 a.m. The house was dead silent except for the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. I sat cross-legged on the faded rug of the spare bedroom. Mia was awake, nursing quietly. She felt like a warm, fragile anchor against my chest. In my free hand, I held a heavy textbook on introductory financial law. Mrs. Gallagher had checked it out from the local university library for me. I read the chapters under the dim yellow light of a desk lamp. I studied the mechanics of interest rates, default judgments, and lien structures. I memorized the exact legal language my sister had used to weaponize capital against me. I decided in that quiet room to master the system that nearly destroyed me. I could not rely on standard high school biology or geometry to secure our future. I needed to understand how money moved. I needed to know how debt was bought and sold. I needed to learn how the law overwhelmingly protected the creditor over the debtor. I resolved to become untouchable. The first step was erasing my past. I walked into a cheap electronics store the following morning and purchased a prepaid cellular phone. I took my old device, the one Richard had paid for, and tossed it into a gas station trash bin. I went online and permanently deleted every social media profile I owned. I ignored friend requests from former classmates. I blocked the numbers of any mutual acquaintances who might serve as a bridge back to my biological parents. I became a phantom. If Susan or Richard ever experienced a fleeting moment of guilt and tried to find me, they would hit a concrete wall. I ensured they would never even learn the name of their own granddaughter. Emancipation meant I was legally responsible for my own survival. Mrs. Gallagher provided a safe roof, but I refused to be a financial burden to her. I secured a job waiting tables at a late-night diner on the edge of the county. The uniform was a stiff polyester dress that smelled permanently of stale coffee and industrial bleach. The shifts were grueling. I worked from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, serving burnt toast and greasy eggs to long-haul truck drivers and insomniacs. The tips were mostly loose change and crumpled dollar bills left on sticky laminate tables. Every night when the diner emptied out around 3 o'clock, I propped my cheap tablet against a metal napkin dispenser. I enrolled in online community college courses. I studied macroeconomics and accounting principles while the fry cook listened to the radio in the back kitchen. I took my midterm exam sitting on an overturned plastic milk crate in the employee break room. The physical toll was severe. Sleep became a rare luxury measured in 2-hour increments. My hands cracked from washing heavy ceramic dishes in scalding water. Dark purple circles carved permanent shadows beneath my eyes. There were mornings when my legs shook from exhaustion as I walked back to Mrs. Gallagher's house. But every single time the fatigue threatened to pull me under, I remembered the cold rain on my skin. I remembered my father changing the locks. I remembered Payton waving from her warm bedroom window. That memory served as a relentless, brutal engine pushing me forward. Mia was my compass. I watched her learn to walk by pulling herself up on the edge of the coffee table. I watched her babble her first words. I vowed that she would never wear hand-me-down shoes or feel the sharp sting of conditional love. Every dollar I saved in a glass jar under my bed was a brick in our wall. 2 years passed in a blur of caffeine and highlighted textbooks. I maintained a flawless 4.0 grade average at the community college. My professors began to notice the quiet young mother who dismantled complex financial models with surgical precision. One afternoon, my advanced accounting instructor pulled me aside. He handed me a glossy application packet for a top-tier university renowned for its elite finance program. He told me I belonged in the ivy-covered halls of institutional wealth, not a local junior college. I filled out the application that night. The prompt asked for a personal statement about overcoming adversity. I did not invent a fake sports injury like I had done for Payton years ago. I wrote the unvarnished truth. I wrote about being thrown onto a wet lawn at 16. I wrote about rebuilding my life from a school nurse cot. I wrote about studying corporate valuation while wiping down diner booths. I submitted the packet and returned to my night shifts. 3 months later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It did not contain a default notice. It held an official acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious undergraduate finance programs in the country. Attached to the letter was a financial aid breakdown detailing a full academic scholarship. Tuition, housing, and textbooks were entirely covered by a private endowment. I handed the letter to Mrs. Gallagher. She read the crisp parchment and simply nodded. It was the solemn nod of a general acknowledging a hard-won battlefield victory. Moving away from the safety of that brick house was terrifying. I packed my few belongings and secured a tiny off-campus apartment for Mia and myself. I stepped onto the manicured campus grounds wearing cheap thrift store sweaters. I was surrounded by students who drove luxury sedans paid for by their parents. They wore designer coats and complained about the campus dining options. They had no idea what it felt like to freeze in the dark. I treated my education like a tactical strike. While my wealthy peers spent their weekends drinking away their trust funds at fraternity parties, I practically lived in the university library. I dissected corporate valuation models and distressed asset management. I learned how failing companies were dismantled and sold for parts. I learned how predatory debt could be leveraged to force a surrender. I became a machine designed to process numbers and project risk. Graduation loomed on the horizon. I stood at the top of my class. I landed a highly coveted interview at an elite wealth management firm located in the financial district of a major city. The starting salary eclipsed what my father earned in 5 years. But as I walked into the glass-paneled lobby of the firm, I quickly realized a harsh truth. A brilliant degree did not erase my background. I was about to enter a corporate shark tank. The executives in these high-rise towers looked, sounded, and acted exactly like the family who banished me. The real war was no longer about surviving poverty. The next battle was surviving a cutthroat industry designed to chew up outsiders and protect its own. I crossed the commencement stage wearing a rented black gown and a gold tassel. The university dean handed me my diploma and spoke my name into the microphone. I graduated in the top percentile of my class. I earned my finance degree in less than 4 years. I did not attend the lavish celebration banquets hosted by the wealthy alumni network. I did not pop champagne in the campus courtyard. I walked straight to my small off-campus apartment to review interview preparation materials, while Mia colored in her coloring book at our tiny kitchen table. I had secured a degree, but a piece of paper alone could not shield us from the world. I needed an anchor in the global market. 2 weeks later, I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby of Sterling Crest Capital. The wealth management firm operated out of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. They managed billions of dollars in distressed assets, private equity, and corporate restructuring. The entry-level analyst position was notoriously grueling. Thousands of recent graduates submitted applications. The Human Resources Department selected exactly 5 candidates for the junior cohort. I was the only woman in the group. I was also the only person who had ever scrubbed diner floors at 3 in the morning, or calculated the cost of infant formula down to the final penny. My new peers were legacy hires, born into extraordinary privilege. I worked alongside men named Brooks and Harrison. They wore custom-tailored Italian suits that cost more than my first car. They spent their weekends racing sailboats or attending exclusive networking galas. They looked at my practical, sensible heels and my off-the-rack skirts with thinly veiled amusement. The corporate culture on the trading floor was steeped in a toxic blend of entrenched elitism and casual misogyny. They assumed my presence was the result of a diversity quota. They believed I lacked the pedigree required to survive the long, grueling hours of high finance. During my first week on the floor, Brooks provided a clear demonstration of their mindset. We were sitting in a glass-walled conference room reviewing a dense merger prospectus. He finished his beverage and slid his empty ceramic mug across the mahogany table toward me. He did not ask for a favor. He instructed me to fetch him a fresh pour and noted that the cream ratio was off the last time. He wanted me to play the role of his personal assistant. I did not raise my voice. I did not flush with anger or storm out of the room. I picked up the ceramic mug and walked over to his workstation. I placed the cup directly on top of his printed risk assessment spreadsheets, leaving a wet, circular stain on the paper. I looked him dead in the eye and stated in a flat, steady tone that I was hired to restructure corporate debt, not run a cafeteria. I turned my back to him and walked into the senior partner's office to deliver the portfolio analysis Brooks was supposed to finish the previous afternoon. My colleagues operated on fragile ego. They wanted to close flashy deals to afford expensive sports cars and impress women at rooftop bars. Their motivation was entirely superficial. My drive was rooted in something far more primal. I ran on pure survival instinct. I needed to ensure Mia never knew the cold sting of a locked door or the terror of an eviction notice. While Harrison took 2-hour lunches at high-end steakhouses, I ate a turkey sandwich at my desk. I dug through thousands of pages of corporate tax filings and complex derivative contracts. I searched for anomalies. I looked for the hidden liabilities that other analysts missed because they were too lazy to read the footnotes. 6 months into the role, our division was tasked with evaluating a regional logistics company for a potential acquisition. The senior partners were eager to sign the term sheet and finalize the buyout. The spreadsheet projections provided by the company looked flawless. The profit margins were steadily climbing. But as I reviewed the ledger, I recognized a familiar, deceptive pattern. It was the exact same fraudulent accounting architecture my sister had used to hide her exorbitant credit card debt a decade ago. The numbers were artificially manipulated to inflate the company valuation while burying the debt in obscure subsidiary accounts. I spent 3 consecutive nights awake in my apartment mapping the hidden offshore liabilities. I drank black coffee and built a bulletproof financial model exposing the rot beneath the surface. I compiled a thick dossier of undeniable proof. I bypassed my direct manager and walked straight into the managing director's office. I laid the binder onto his desk and explained the trap. My diligent research saved the firm $40 million in toxic exposure. The acquisition was immediately canceled. Brooks and Harrison were quietly reassigned to dead-end accounts in a different department. I was promoted to a senior portfolio manager role 3 years ahead of the standard corporate schedule. At 24 years old, I received my first major performance bonus. The direct deposit hit my checking account on a Tuesday morning. It was a staggering 6-figure sum. I stared at the glowing numbers on my computer screen and felt a profound shift in my reality. I did not buy a sports car. I did not purchase designer jewelry or luxury watches. I hired a real estate agent and purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet, secure neighborhood with excellent public schools. I painted Mia's new room a soft shade of lavender. I bought her a sturdy oak bed and a bookshelf to hold her favorite stories. I stood in the doorway watching her sleep that first night and knew the fortress was finally complete. The walls were impenetrable. With my immediate future solidified and my daughter safe, I finally allowed myself to look backward. I possessed the capital and the resources to seek answers without ever exposing my location. I wanted to know the exact status of the people who threw me into the rain. I hired a highly discreet private investigator based in my Ohio hometown. I paid a premium retainer to guarantee absolute silence and thoroughness. I instructed him to pull public records. I needed property deeds, tax filings, civil court dockets, and credit reports. I did not care about their emotional well-being. I cared exclusively about their balance sheets. The first manila envelope arrived via courier a month later. I sat in my spacious home office and reviewed the contents. The documents painted a pathetic, tragic picture of a family rotting from the inside out. Payton had reinvented herself on the internet. She curated a digital persona as a wealthy luxury lifestyle influencer. Her social media profiles featured her posing in front of rented mansions and leased sports cars. She posted photos wearing high-fashion garments that still had the retail tags tucked inside the collars so she could return them the next day. She projected an image of effortless success and immense wealth to thousands of strangers online. But the private investigator uncovered the ugly truth funding her elaborate illusion. Payton was not generating any real income. Her endorsement deals were fake. Her brand sponsorships were non-existent. She was bleeding Richard and Susan dry. The financial records showed a relentless downward trajectory. Richard had taken out a second mortgage on my childhood home. He liquidated his primary retirement accounts and cashed out his pension early, incurring severe tax penalties. Susan had opened multiple high-interest personal loans under her own name. They were financing Payton's fake internet life. They were paying the rent on her luxury apartment in the city and covering her spiraling credit card minimums. They had drained their entire life savings to maintain the fiction that their golden child was a triumph. Payton was a parasite, and they were willing hosts. I analyzed their debt-to-income ratio using the same cold metrics I applied to failing corporations at the firm. The math was indisputable. The Farley family was a distressed asset. Their liabilities far exceeded their dwindling cash flow. The interest rates on their personal loans were compounding faster than they could manage. They were mathematically guaranteed to collapse. I did not pick up the phone to call them and gloat. I did not send an anonymous warning to Richard about his impending bankruptcy. I simply placed the documents back into the manila folder and locked the dossier inside my fireproof safe. I returned to my demanding job at the wealth management firm. I continued to rise through the corporate ranks, building my war chest dollar by dollar. I knew the exact timeline of their financial ruin. I knew that soon their defaulted debt would be bundled and sold to the highest institutional bidder. I just had to wait patiently in the shadows until the inevitable foreclosure crossed into my territory. By my 25th birthday, my life bore zero resemblance to the terrified teenager shivering in a diner booth. I was a senior portfolio manager earning a high six-figure salary. I wore tailored wool suits and operated out of a corner office overlooking the city skyline. I commanded the respect of men twice my age because I possessed an uncanny ability to dissect failing businesses and extract value from the wreckage. I was ruthless in my assessments, but fair in my execution. My personal life was just as meticulously curated. Mia was now 9 years old. She was a bright, vibrant fourth grader who took ballet lessons and complained about long division. We lived in a stunning modern home surrounded by manicured gardens. Every morning, I poured her orange juice and braided her hair before driving her to a prestigious private academy. She knew nothing of the cold rain. She only knew warmth. She only knew security. I had successfully broken the generational curse. My days at Sterling Crest Capital were filled with high-stakes acquisitions. Our firm specialized in purchasing distressed debt bundles from smaller regional banks. We bought toxic loans for pennies on the dollar and either restructured the financing or liquidated the underlying assets. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November when the ultimate plot twist arrived on my mahogany desk. A Midwestern banking institution was offloading a large portfolio of non-performing residential mortgages. The file contained thousands of rows of data representing families who had fallen behind on their payments. I was tasked with evaluating the risk profile of the Ohio bundle. I sat in my ergonomic chair and scrolled through the digital spreadsheet. I scanned the zip codes, looking for regional trends in the default rates. My eyes tracked down the illuminated screen line by line. Then, my finger froze on the computer mouse. I stopped breathing. Row 412 contained a very familiar sequence of numbers. I stared at the street address printed in the stark black font. It was my childhood home. For a fraction of a second, the sleek glass walls of my corporate office faded away. I could feel the biting October wind. I could hear the heavy brass deadbolt sliding into place. I could see my mother's cold, unyielding expression. The ghosts of my past were suddenly staring back at me from a financial ledger. I clicked on the specific file and opened the detailed financial autopsy of Richard and Susan Farley. The numbers painted a brutal, unforgiving picture. They were $150,000 in arrears. They had not made a single mortgage payment in over 9 months. The regional bank had exhausted every standard collection effort. The grace periods were gone. The forbearance options were voided. My parents were exactly 30 days away from facing a mandatory county foreclosure. A sheriff was scheduled to walk up those concrete steps and nail a final eviction notice to the very door they had once slammed in my face. I dug deeper into the transaction history. I needed to understand how a man as fiscally conservative as my father had allowed his life to disintegrate. The paper trail was tragic and entirely predictable. Richard had taken out a second mortgage to cover the initial gaps in his cash flow. When that money vanished, he liquidated his pension. He paid steep early withdrawal penalties just to access the funds. The ledger showed dozens of wire transfers routed directly into accounts controlled by Payton. My older sister had drained them down to the foundation. She used their retirement savings to fund her fake internet persona. I pulled out my phone and searched her public profile. Payton had just posted a photo from a luxury resort in Mexico. She was holding a tropical cocktail and wearing a designer swimsuit. Her caption boasted about living her best authentic life. The irony was staggering. She was sipping overpriced drinks while the two people who enabled her entire existence were about to lose their roof. Once Payton realized the money was truly gone, she simply cut her losses. She abandoned them. She stopped answering their calls and left them to face the catastrophic consequences of her greed. I sat in the quiet hum of my office and weighed my options. I could easily approve the portfolio acquisition and let the standard corporate machinery take its course. Our firm would absorb the debt. Our legal department would process the foreclosure. My parents would be evicted by nameless, faceless attorneys. They would become another forgotten statistic in a corporate quarterly report. It would be a clean, anonymous end to their reign. But anonymous felt insufficient. An eviction executed by a faceless bank would allow Susan and Richard to play the victims. They would blame the economy. They would blame greedy lenders. They would never be forced to confront the direct consequences of their own cruelty. I did not want them to lose their home to a stranger. I wanted them to know exactly who held the gavel. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the number for my personal wealth attorney. I instructed him to immediately form a private holding company. We registered an anonymous limited liability corporation in a neighboring state. The paperwork was expedited and finalized within 48 hours. Once the shell company was established, I initiated a wire transfer from my own personal savings. I used my own liquid capital to purchase the specific distressed note out of the Ohio bundle. I offered the regional bank a premium on that single mortgage, separating it from the rest of the institutional acquisition. The bank was thrilled to offload a toxic asset at a favorable margin. They signed the transfer documents without hesitation. A week later, a thick courier envelope arrived at my house. I sat at my kitchen table after Mia had gone to sleep. I opened the flap and pulled out the crisp legal documents. The title, the original loan agreement, and the formal deed of trust were all printed on heavy stock paper. I flipped to the final page and signed my name on the assignee line. The ink dried. The transaction was legally binding. I was no longer just a discarded daughter. I was the sole legal lien holder of the Farley residence. I owned the peeling paint on the siding. I owned the concrete steps where I had scraped my knees. I owned the wet grass where my duffel bag had landed 10 years prior. I held their entire future, their shelter, and their safety in my manicured hands. I placed the documents into a sleek black leather folder. The sense of power was intoxicating, but I kept my emotions strictly calibrated. I did not feel a frantic need for revenge. I felt a profound, icy clarity. The universe had delivered the perfect mechanism for closure directly to my desk. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I logged onto my computer and booked a first-class ticket to Ohio for the following Tuesday. I reserved a luxury rental car, ensuring it was a vehicle Richard could never afford, even in his prime. I selected a tailored charcoal suit from my closet. Every single detail of my return was engineered to project undeniable authority. My parents had spent the last decade believing they had successfully purged a liability from their perfect lives. They thought their biggest problem was a looming bank deadline. They had no idea that the bank was currently packing a briefcase and boarding a flight. The reckoning was no longer an abstract concept. It was a scheduled appointment, and I was determined to be right on time. The flight from the East Coast landed smoothly in the crisp Midwestern morning. I walked through the small regional airport and located the luxury rental agency. I selected a silver Porsche Panamera. I navigated the heavy vehicle through the familiar suburban streets. Every turn resurrected a dormant memory. I drove past the local high school where I had collapsed in the hallway. I drove past the 24-hour diner where I had sought shelter from the freezing rain. The entire town felt smaller than I remembered. The neighborhoods had shifted over the past 10 years. The vibrant, manicured lawns of my youth were replaced by overgrown hedges and fading facades. The economic decline was visible on every street corner. I pulled the heavy vehicle into the cracked concrete driveway of my childhood home. The engine purred with a low, expensive hum before I turned the ignition off. I gripped the leather steering wheel for a brief moment, steadying my pulse. I stepped out of the driver's seat. My leather heels clicked against the uneven pavement. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. The contrast felt surreal. My pristine vehicle sat like a silver spaceship on their weed-choked concrete. I walked up the front steps. I noticed the old porch swing hanging by a single rusted chain. The wood was splintered and rotting. I pressed the brass doorbell. A dull chime echoed inside the house. The heavy oak door creaked open. Susan stood in the threshold. She held a ceramic coffee mug in both hands. Her hair was thinning and threaded with dull gray strands. She wore a faded fleece robe that looked years old. She expected to see a delivery driver or a neighbor. When she looked up and her eyes met mine, the breath rushed out of her lungs. The ceramic mug slipped right through her trembling fingers. It hit the porch and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. Dark brown coffee splashed against her bare ankles. Her knees gave out. She sank onto the wet concrete. Susan did not try to stand up. She remained kneeling on the cold, hard surface. Her hands shook as she reached toward the ceramic shards, but she did not touch them. She was paralyzed. Her wide eyes traveled from the gleaming silver paint of the Porsche parked in her driveway up to the hem of my trousers. She traced the structured seams of my designer blazer. She searched my face for the terrified 16-year-old girl she threw into a freezing storm. She could not find her. That frightened child evaporated a long time ago. She saw a woman who radiated authority and wealth. The cognitive dissonance was breaking her mind in real time. Inside the house, heavy footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor. Richard marched toward the open doorway. He shouted a question, asking his wife what she dropped. He stepped onto the porch and abruptly halted. The sudden stop threw him off balance. He grabbed the wooden door frame to steady himself. His gaze locked onto the luxury car occupying his property. I watched his mind calculate the six-figure price tag. Then he looked down at his wife, kneeling among the broken ceramics. Finally, he looked directly at me. The past decade had carved deep ravines into my father's forehead. The stress of financing Payton's fake internet lifestyle had aged him 2 decades. His shoulders carried a permanent, defeated slump. The crisp, authoritative posture he once wielded to intimidate me was entirely gone. But old defense mechanisms operate on pure instinct. Panic flashed across his weathered features, followed immediately by a desperate need to establish dominance. He puffed out his chest. He clenched his fists tight at his sides. He tried to summon his old booming voice, but it cracked slightly on the first syllable. Richard demanded to know what I was doing on his property. He pointed a shaking finger at the street. He reminded me of the specific instructions he delivered a decade ago. He stated I was told never to return to this neighborhood. His eyes darted back to the Porsche. A cynical, bitter sneer twisted his lips. He assumed I was playing a shallow, petty game. He asked if I rented the vehicle just to impress them. He suggested I married a wealthy, older man so I could come back and flaunt a fake lifestyle. He told me they were not interested in a dramatic, tearful reconciliation. He claimed their family was perfectly fine without me. He demanded I turn around and leave before he called the local authorities to report a trespasser. He spoke fast, trying to build a wall of words to protect his fragile pride. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my hard-won accomplishments. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to cry or seek his paternal approval. The man standing before me was no longer a towering, scary patriarch. He was just a delinquent debtor holding a remarkably weak hand. I looked at him with the exact same clinical detachment I reserve for failing corporate executives during a hostile boardroom acquisition. I let his empty threats hang in the crisp autumn air. I allowed the silence to stretch between us. The quiet made him incredibly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight nervously from his left foot to his right. I glanced past his shoulder into the dimly lit living room. The interior smelled of stale dust and quiet despair. The expensive leather furniture from my youth was gone. It had been replaced by cheap, worn alternatives likely purchased from a second-hand store. The walls looked bare. The framed photographs of Payton smiling in her cheerleading uniform were faded by sunlight. They had sold everything of value to keep their golden child afloat. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. My fingers wrapped around the smooth texture of a black presentation folder. I pulled the document holder out and extended it toward him. I informed my father that I had not come to beg for a relationship. I stated very clearly, in a flat, even tone, that my visit was strictly a business matter. Richard hesitated. His inherent paranoia wrestled with his deep curiosity. He snatched the folder from my outstretched hand. He flipped the heavy cover open. He reached into the front pocket of his faded flannel shirt and retrieved a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He slid them onto the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the top page. The heavy folder contained the original loan agreement, the formal deed of trust, and the final notice of default. The pages were stamped with the official blue seal of the county clerk. I watched his eyes scan the bold, standardized text. He recognized the legal formatting immediately. The bold red letters at the top indicated a pending eviction status. He had likely received dozens of similar warning letters from the regional bank over the past 9 months. A tired, resigned sigh escaped his lungs. His shoulders slumped further. He thought I had somehow intercepted his mail. He assumed I came here just to mock his financial ruin and rub my success in his face. He opened his mouth to yell at me again. He prepared another barrage of insults. But I raised a single index finger, silencing him mid-sentence. I instructed him to skip the summary. I told him to read the final paragraph on the second page. I told him to look very closely at the name of the new lien holder. Richard turned the crisp white page. The thick paper rustled in the quiet morning breeze. His index finger traced the dense legal jargon detailing the transfer of the distressed asset. He read the clause explaining that the original bank had sold the note in its entirety to a private buyer. His fingertips stopped near the bottom right corner of the document. He read the typed assignee signature line. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His jaw fell slack. The deep wrinkles around his mouth deepened into a mask of pure terror. He dropped the folder. The heavy paper hit the concrete porch with a soft thud, landing right next to the spilled coffee. He looked up at me. His voice was a barely audible rasp. He spoke my full name aloud like an incantation. He realized in a single, terrifying heartbeat that the pregnant daughter he discarded into a storm was the exact entity who now owned the roof over his head. I stepped past my father. I did not ask for an invitation. I crossed the threshold into the foyer and walked directly into the main living space. The air inside the house felt stagnant and heavy. It smelled of stale tobacco mildew and deep, irreversible regret. 10 years ago, this room was a pristine showcase of suburban success. Susan used to hire a professional cleaning service twice a week to polish the hardwood floors and dust the expensive crystal chandelier. Now the floorboards were scuffed and covered in a dull layer of grime. The crystal fixture overhead was missing several glass pendants. The luxurious velvet sofas of my childhood were gone. They had been replaced by a mismatched fabric couch that looked like a cheap garage sale leftover. There was a dark yellow watermark spreading across the ceiling plaster. The physical decay of the property perfectly mirrored the moral decay of the people inhabiting it. Richard slowly closed the heavy oak front door. He carried the black legal folder containing the foreclosure deed as if it were a live explosive. He followed me into the living room. His posture was broken. Susan trailed closely behind him. Her bare feet shuffled across the cold floorboards. She had stopped crying. Her initial shock morphed into a frantic, desperate energy. They both stood near the edge of a stained area rug. I took a seat in the only armchair that looked structurally sound. I crossed my legs and rested my designer leather tote bag on my lap. I was the master of the house now. I did not need to raise my voice to command the space. My silence forced them to scramble for a defense. Susan could not handle the quiet. Her entire identity relied on maintaining a false narrative where she was always the righteous victim. She pointed a trembling finger at my tailored charcoal suit. She raised her voice, attempting to summon the same self-righteous anger she wielded the night she banished me. Susan stated that I had no right to return and flaunt my wealth. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. She claimed this financial ruin was my fault. She sobbed and insisted that if I had not stolen their $40,000 a decade ago, they would never have fallen behind on their mortgage payments. She accused me of destroying their financial foundation. She painted herself as a martyr who sacrificed everything to survive the supposed devastation I caused. I listened to her frantic accusations. I felt a profound sense of pity, mixed with utter disdain. She was still clinging to a decade-old fiction because facing the reality of her own failures was too painful. 10 years ago, her harsh words would have shattered my heart. I would have cried and begged her to believe my innocence. But the woman sitting in her living room was a senior portfolio manager who evaluated toxic corporate assets for a living. I did not deal in emotions. I dealt exclusively in verifiable data. I unzipped the top compartment of my structured leather bag. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, spiral-bound document. It was over 200 pages long. The cover featured the embossed logo of a premier forensic accounting firm based in New York City. I had paid these elite financial investigators a premium retainer to reconstruct the past decade of my family's banking history. I tossed the heavy report onto the scuffed wooden coffee table separating us. It landed with a loud, definitive smack. The sound echoed off the bare walls. I instructed Susan to open the binder. I told her to turn to the tab labeled Exhibit A. She hesitated. Her hands remained frozen at her sides. Richard stepped forward and picked up the heavy report. He flipped through the thick pages. His fingers continued to tremble. I spoke with a calm, measured cadence. I explained that the document contained a microscopic analysis of the $40,000 theft they blamed on me. I detailed how my investigators secured court-ordered subpoenas to track the routing numbers involved in the original home equity withdrawal. The money did not vanish into an anonymous void. It followed a very specific digital breadcrumb trail. I pointed to a highlighted section on the page Richard was currently reading. I explained that the funds were initially transferred into a shell account registered under a fake corporate entity. But the investigators pierced the corporate veil with ease. They tracked the subsequent withdrawals from that shell account. The money was used to pay off 3 distinct high-yield credit cards. I listed the exact last 4 digits of those credit cards aloud. I watched Susan's face drain of color as she recognized the sequence of numbers. They were the exact same credit accounts Payton had opened in our parents' names years prior. The forensic report proved that the offshore internet protocol address Payton used to frame me was actually a virtual private network. That specific network subscription was purchased using Payton's own personal checking account. I recited the itemized purchases aloud to ensure they understood the gravity of their mistake. Every single cent of the stolen equity line went directly toward paying off Payton's secret shopping addiction. While I was sleeping in a diner booth hiding my pregnant belly, my sister was using their stolen equity to buy a diamond tennis bracelet, VIP table service at a downtown nightclub, and a luxury vacation to a tropical resort. I did not stop there. I instructed Richard to flip to Chapter 4 of the binder. I wanted them to see the full, staggering scope of their golden child's betrayal. This section detailed the fraudulent retail credit card Payton opened using my stolen Social Security number. It contained the original application. The digital signature was traced directly to her college dormitory internet connection. I explained how their perfect eldest daughter committed identity theft against a minor to protect her own lavish lifestyle and ensure I remained trapped in poverty. The truth descended upon the room like a suffocating blanket. Richard stared at the highlighted bank statements. His eyes scanned the undeniable proof. He saw the forged signatures. He reviewed the matched routing numbers. He read the documented timeline. The meticulously gathered evidence dismantled a 10-year lie in less than 5 minutes. He realized that the daughter he threw onto the freezing grass was entirely innocent. He realized the daughter he worshipped had robbed him blind, framed her pregnant teenage sister, and left him to face bankruptcy alone. The financial ruin they were currently enduring was not the result of my teenage rebellion. It was the direct consequence of funding a sociopath. Richard collapsed into the worn fabric sofa. The heavy binder slipped from his grasp and landed beside him. He buried his face in his weathered hands. His shoulders began to heave. A low, guttural sob escaped his throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of a man mourning the destruction of his own legacy by his own hands. Susan backed away from the coffee table. She shook her head back and forth in rapid, frantic denial. She refused to accept the data. She stammered that the papers must be fabricated. She claimed I forged the report just to enact some sick revenge fantasy. She insisted her beloved Payton would never commit such horrific crimes. Susan was desperate to protect the fragile glass house she had built her entire identity around. If she accepted the truth, she would have to admit she was a monster who abandoned a vulnerable child to the elements. I smiled a cold, empty smile. I told Susan she did not have to take my word for it. I informed her that the forensic accountants had also pulled the most recent public civil filings from the neighboring county courthouse. I reached into my bag and pulled a single sheet of paper from a manila envelope. I laid it gently on the wooden table. It was a formal petition for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. It was filed exactly 3 days ago. The petitioner listed on the legal document was Payton Farley. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes. I explained the reality of her situation. While Susan and Richard were starving to pay her city rent and fund her fake internet lifestyle, their golden child was legally wiping out her debts. Payton was preparing to walk away from them forever, leaving them holding the bag for every single loan they co-signed. The silence in the room was deafening. The illusion was dead. The receipts were laid bare. The foundation of their toxic family dynamic had just been pulverized into dust. And right on cue, the sound of a key scratching at the front door lock shattered the quiet. The architect of their destruction had just arrived to demand more money. The heavy oak front door swung open with a loud, jarring thud. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels echoed down the hardwood hallway. Payton had arrived. She did not bother to announce her entry with a greeting. She started speaking the moment she crossed the threshold. Her voice carried the exact same entitled pitch it possessed a decade ago. She complained loudly about a sudden delay in a lucrative brand sponsorship. She demanded that Richard wire $5,000 into her checking account before noon to cover an unspecified business emergency. She marched toward the living room, expecting her parents to scramble for their checkbooks, just like they always did. Payton rounded the corner and stepped onto the stained area rug. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a beige trench coat draped over her shoulders. A quilted leather handbag hung from her forearm. She looked every bit the successful internet influencer she pretended to be. Then her eyes landed on the scene unfolding in the center of the room. She saw Susan weeping near the sofa. She saw Richard staring blankly at the floor with his shoulders slumped in defeat. Finally, her gaze shifted to the armchair. She looked at the woman sitting in the tailored charcoal suit. Payton stopped dead in her tracks. Her manicured hands tightened around the handles of her luxury purse. She slowly lowered her oversized sunglasses. The color drained from her cheeks. For 3 silent seconds, the master manipulator was entirely speechless. She recognized the sister she had discarded into the freezing rain. Survival instincts kicked in. Payton had spent her entire adult life escaping accountability through theatrical deflection. She dropped her designer bag onto the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me and let out a shrill, exaggerated gasp. She asked Richard what I was doing inside their house. She demanded to know why they allowed a thief back into their lives. Richard opened his mouth to answer, but his vocal cords failed him. He just gestured weakly toward the heavy, spiral-bound report resting on the coffee table. Payton stepped forward and looked down at the forensic accounting binder. She saw the prominent logo of the New York financial investigation firm embossed on the cover. She saw the highlighted bank routing numbers tracking her decade of theft. The trap was visible, and she knew she was standing right in the center of it. Her panic was instantaneous, but she immediately weaponized it. She flipped the cover shut and slapped her palm against the cardboard binding. She turned to Susan and began screaming. She claimed the documents were elaborate forgeries. She insisted I had spent the last 10 years harboring a sick, psychotic jealousy. She told our parents I probably hired someone to Photoshop fake banking records just to ruin her reputation. Payton played the victim with Oscar-worthy conviction. She choked back a manufactured sob and asked Susan how she could ever believe such vicious lies about her loyal eldest daughter. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her performance. I remained seated in the armchair. I watched her spin her desperate web of fiction with cold, detached fascination. When she paused to catch her breath, I uncrossed my legs and leaned forward. I spoke in a quiet, steady tone that forced everyone in the room to stop and listen. I told Payton she could dispute the forensic accounting report if she wished, but I informed her she would have a much harder time disputing federal court records. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and extracted a crisp white document. I placed it gently on top of the binder. I instructed Richard to read the top line. It was the Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition filed in the neighboring county courthouse exactly 3 days ago. The petitioner listed was Payton Farley. Payton froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. I looked directly into her panicked eyes and dismantled her defense. I recited the federal docket number from memory. I named the specific bankruptcy attorney she had retained on a flat fee basis. I explained the legal strategy she was currently executing. I told our father that his golden child was using the federal court system to permanently discharge the high-interest personal loans he and Susan had co-signed to keep her afloat. I laid out the brutal math. Payton was legally wiping her slate clean and leaving our parents to absorb the full, devastating impact of the debt. She was preparing to walk away while the bank foreclosed on their home. Payton stammered. The flawless influencer facade began to crack. She frantically pivoted her defense strategy. She abandoned the forgery accusation and tried to justify her actions. She turned to Richard and claimed the money was a necessary investment for her digital brand. She promised she was going to pay them back tenfold as soon as her marketing contracts cleared. She begged him to understand the intense pressure she was under to maintain her online image. I asked her to name a single legitimate corporate sponsor. The room fell silent. I asked her to produce one valid contract that proved her business generated actual revenue. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She had nothing. I cited the itemized forensic ledger from the table. I listed the luxury beach resorts, the expensive cosmetic procedures, and the designer boutiques where she had squandered our parents' retirement funds. I noted that her return on investment was zero. I reminded her that the only tangible result of her business venture was a pending eviction notice scheduled for the end of the month. Payton was cornered. The irrefutable data stripped away every layer of her false reality. But I had one final piece of evidence to present. I stood up from the armchair. I pulled a single, laminated sheet of paper from my briefcase. I walked over to the sofa and handed it directly to Richard. I told him to look closely at the attached signature. It was the original application for the fraudulent retail credit card, opened in my name 10 years ago. It was the exact financial instrument Payton used to destroy my credit score while I was a 17-year-old mother trying to buy infant formula. I pointed to the sweeping loops and sharp angles of the handwriting. I explained that private investigators had verified the Internet protocol address used to submit the digital portions of the application. It traced directly back to Payton's university dormitory. I looked at my father and delivered the final blow. I told him his perfect eldest daughter did not just steal his home equity. She committed felony identity theft against a minor. She broke federal laws to ensure her pregnant teenage sister remained chained to poverty. The walls closed in on Payton. She could not charm her way out of hard data and federal forms. She could not manipulate a forensic audit. The realization that her 10-year reign of deception was over shattered her completely. The sophisticated lifestyle influencer vanished. In her place stood a feral, cornered animal. Payton lost her mind. She devolved into a screaming, vicious tantrum. She stomped her expensive high heels against the grimy floorboards. She turned her rage toward the only people left to attack. Payton pointed a shaking finger at Richard. She dropped her sweet, loving daughter routine and bared her teeth. She screamed that he was a pathetic failure for running out of money. She blamed him for not working harder to provide her with the lifestyle she deserved. She turned to Susan and called her weak and suffocating. Payton shouted that she only stole the funds because they were too cheap to support her dreams properly. She hurled every cruel insult she could weaponize against the two people who had sacrificed everything for her. She blamed them for her bankruptcy. She blamed them for her fraudulent choices. She revealed the dark, ugly core of her true personality without a single ounce of restraint. Richard and Susan sat paralyzed on the worn fabric sofa. They did not try to argue. They did not try to calm her down. They watched their beautiful, perfect idol unravel into a screaming, vicious monster. The horror etched into their faces was absolute. The silence that followed her screaming fit set the stage for a profound and devastating shift in power. Payton stopped screaming. Her chest heaved. The vicious insults she hurled hung in the stagnant air of the living room. She had finally revealed the hollow, ugly core of her character. Richard and Susan stared at their eldest daughter. The illusion was shattered. The pristine image of the perfect cheerleader crumbled into dust. They saw a predator. They saw the thief who orchestrated their financial ruin. And simultaneously, they saw the horrific truth of what they had done to me. They realized they had banished an innocent, vulnerable 16-year-old girl into a freezing rainstorm to protect a sociopath. The psychological weight of that realization struck my father like a physical blow. Richard was a man who built his entire identity on unyielding authority. Growing up, he ruled our household with strict discipline and an iron fist. He managed a local manufacturing plant and prided himself on rigid metrics and flawless control. He never displayed weakness. He viewed emotion as a defect. Yet standing in that decaying room, surrounded by the undeniable proof of his own gullibility, his stoic facade disintegrated. His legs lost their strength. He stumbled backward and collapsed into a faded recliner near the window. He buried his weathered face in his hands. A raw, guttural sob tore through his chest. It was the first time in my 26 years of life that I ever witnessed my father cry. He wept with profound agony. His shoulders shook with the despair of a patriarch who realized he had destroyed his own legacy. He mourned the loss of his wealth. He mourned the loss of his reputation. But mostly, he mourned the devastating fact that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen Payton over me. Now he was reaping the barren harvest of that decision. I watched him weep. I felt no urge to comfort him. The tears of a broken man 10 years too late offered zero solace to the teenager who once begged for his protection. My heart remained as cold and steady as a metronome. Susan could not process the silence. She needed to rewrite the narrative. My mother always required a script where she played the noble victim or the forgiving saint. Her entire social standing used to revolve around neighborhood book clubs and flawless holiday parties. Now she was standing in a filthy house, facing the daughter she discarded. She looked at Richard weeping in the chair. Then she looked at Payton panting in the center of the room. Susan turned her frantic gaze toward me. She saw the tailored charcoal suit. She saw the expensive leather briefcase. She saw the undeniable manifestation of success. A desperate, hungry light ignited in her eyes. She thought she could bridge the 10-year chasm with a single emotional plea. Susan took a step forward. Her bare feet shuffled across the scuffed hardwood floor. She extended her trembling hands toward me. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, carving paths through her faded makeup. She whispered my name. Her voice was thick with manufactured sorrow. She begged for forgiveness. She claimed they were blind and foolish. She sobbed that they never meant to hurt me. She tried to grab my wrist. She wanted physical contact to anchor her apologies. I took a swift, deliberate step backward. I moved out of her reach. Her empty hands grasped nothing but the stagnant air. I refused to let her touch me. My physical boundary was impenetrable. Her rejection deepened her desperation. Susan dropped to her knees. She looked up at me with pleading eyes. She shifted her strategy from apologizing to me to inquiring about the one thing she thought could melt my resolve. She asked about my child. She asked about the baby I was carrying the night she threw me away. She used the word grandchild. She sobbed that she wanted to meet her grandchild. She pleaded for a second chance to be a real family. She promised they would make everything right if I just gave them an opportunity to heal the past. The word grandchild echoed in my ears. It sparked a fierce protective fire deep inside my chest. I thought of Mia. I pictured my brilliant 10-year-old daughter sitting safely in our beautiful home, reading a book. Mia knew nothing of these broken, toxic people. She possessed a life filled with unconditional love and unwavering security. The idea of allowing Susan anywhere near my daughter was repulsive. Susan did not earn the title of grandmother. She surrendered that right the moment she locked the heavy oak door and left me to freeze. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical pitch. I spoke in a flat, clinical tone that cut through her sobs like a scalpel. I told her to stop speaking. The sharp command silenced her instantly. I informed her that the child she threw away gave birth to a beautiful, healthy girl. I stated that my daughter was safe and thriving. Then I delivered the crushing reality. I told Susan she would never learn my daughter's name. She would never see a photograph of her face. She would never hold her or speak to her. My child was permanently off limits. Susan gasped. Fresh tears pooled in her eyes. She looked at Richard for backup, but my father remained paralyzed in the recliner, trapped in his own spiral of grief. Payton stood frozen in the background, watching her entire support system crumble. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. I controlled every single variable. I stepped closer to the coffee table. I gathered the thick forensic accounting report and slid it back into my designer tote bag. I left the Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition and the foreclosure notice resting on the wooden surface. I wanted them to stare at the physical proof of their ruin. I addressed both of my parents. I told them they were operating under a profound delusion. I explained that returning to this house was never about seeking closure or securing an apology. An apology required remorse. They only felt regret because they were caught. They were only crying because the bank was taking their house. If Payton had successfully hidden her theft, they would have spent the rest of their lives happily believing I was a drug-addicted thief. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer. I looked Richard dead in the eye. I stated that I did not come to this decaying house to reconcile. I did not drive a luxury car across the state to hug the people who erased me. I came here for one specific reason. I came for business. The word business hung in the air. It was sharp and unforgiving. It stripped away all the emotional manipulation Susan was trying to weave. It reminded Richard that I was the sole legal lien holder of his property. The dynamic shifted from a family drama into a rigid legal transaction. They were no longer speaking to their discarded daughter. They were negotiating with their primary creditor. I held the deed to their shelter. I possessed the legal authority to summon the county sheriff and throw their belongings onto the wet grass, just like they did to me 10 years ago. The sheer terror of that realization paralyzed them. They knew I held all the cards. They knew I possessed the capital and the ruthlessness to execute the eviction. They waited in agonizing silence for me to deliver their sentence. I opened my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents printed on heavy, bonded paper. These were not foreclosure notices. They were binding, contractual agreements drafted by my elite wealth management attorneys. I was about to dictate the terms of their survival. I was preparing to offer them an ultimatum so brutal and restrictive it would permanently sever the toxic chains of their past. The reckoning was reaching its ultimate climax. The silence hanging in the living room felt heavier than the storm outside 10 years ago. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of legal documents. The crisp, white pages were bound by a dark blue cover sheet. These contracts were drafted by a team of elite wealth management attorneys in my corporate office. I paid them a premium retainer to construct an agreement so airtight and restrictive that no courtroom in the entire country could pierce it. I placed the stack on the scuffed wooden coffee table right next to the forensic accounting report. I looked at my father sitting paralyzed in the faded recliner. I looked at my mother kneeling on the floorboards. I told them I possessed every legal right to summon the county sheriff today. I explained that standard banking procedure dictated I execute the foreclosure order immediately. I could order a commercial moving crew to pack their remaining possessions into cheap cardboard boxes. I could force them to stand on the wet concrete of the driveway and watch a locksmith change the deadbolts. The poetic justice was undeniable. It was the exact scenario they subjected me to a decade prior. I possessed the power to mirror their cruelty. Susan flinched. She squeezed her eyes shut, anticipating the final blow. She braced her fragile shoulders for the eviction notice. I let them sit with that terrifying image for a long, agonizing moment. Then I delivered the unexpected plot twist. I stated in a flat, steady voice that I was not going to throw them out onto the street. Richard lifted his heavy head. His tear-stained eyes widened in profound shock. A glimmer of desperate hope flickered across Susan's weathered face. They thought my mercy equated to forgiveness. They assumed my refusal to render them homeless meant the family bonds were somehow repaired. They believed the slate was wiped clean. I crushed that fragile hope in an instant. I explained that my decision had nothing to do with love or reconciliation. I told them I was sparing them from the elements because I refused to stoop to their level of cruelty. I built my life and my fortune by operating with a strict, uncompromising moral code. I would not allow their toxic history to corrupt my integrity. Sparing them was not an act of grace. It was a demonstration of my undeniable superiority. I was better than them, and I wanted them to live the rest of their lives knowing it. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the blue cover of the contract stack. I instructed Richard to listen very carefully to the terms of his survival. The air in the room grew thin and rigid. I outlined the first non-negotiable stipulation. The deed to the property would not remain in my personal name. I was placing the real estate into a strict, irrevocable trust managed by a third-party legal firm. Richard and Susan were granted a life estate tenancy. They were permitted to reside within the walls of the house until the day they died. They would not pay rent. I would cover the annual property taxes and the baseline utility costs out of my own pocket. I was essentially funding their basic existence. But there was a devastating catch. They owned nothing. Zero equity. They possessed no borrowing power. They could not take out another loan against the physical structure. They could not sell the land. They could not pass the deed down in a written will. They were reduced to permanent guests living inside a museum of their own failures. I stripped away their ownership and replaced it with a strict, monitored allowance. Richard swallowed hard. The proud factory manager was officially reduced to a dependent. His throat bobbed as he processed the humiliation, but he nodded slowly. He understood the cold math of the situation. He recognized this was the only viable path to keep a roof over his head. Then I delivered the primary condition. I turned my attention toward Payton. She had remained unusually quiet during the legal breakdown. She stood near the entryway, clutching her designer handbag, hoping she could somehow salvage a piece of the pie. She thought she could sneak her way back into their good graces once I left town. I looked back at my father and stated the final clause. I told him Payton was permanently severed from the estate. I explained that the trust contained a hyper-specific behavioral covenant. Payton was legally trespassed from the property, effective immediately. She was not permitted to cross the property line. She could not sleep in her old childhood bedroom. She could not attend holiday dinners in the dining room. Furthermore, Richard and Susan were legally barred from providing her with any financial support. They could not co-sign a car loan. They could not hand her a $20 bill for groceries. They were cut off from their golden child. Payton gasped. Her jaw dropped open in pure outrage. She stepped forward and shrieked that I could not dictate who our parents allowed into their own home. She claimed the terms were illegal and absurd. I did not even look at her. I kept my gaze locked onto Richard. I explained the enforcement mechanism. I informed him that my attorneys hired a private investigator to conduct random, periodic audits of their finances. The legal team would monitor public utility records and local police logs. If the investigators discovered a single unauthorized bank transfer routed to Payton, the deal was voided. If a neighbor reported seeing Payton's luxury rental car parked in the driveway, the contract was nullified. I laid out the consequence with icy precision. I stated that if they violated the covenant even once, I would execute the foreclosure protocol within 24 hours. I would seize the property and sell it to a commercial developer. They would be out on the street before the weekend was over. There were no second chances. There were no appeals. The ultimatum was brutal and brilliant. I forced them into an impossible corner. I stripped away their agency and presented a binary choice. They had to choose between their own physical survival and the daughter they ruined their lives to protect. The scales of justice tipped with a heavy, resounding thud. Susan began to weep again. The reality of the choice crushed her chest. She looked at Payton. She saw the panicked, feral expression on her eldest daughter's face. Then she looked around the decaying living room. She realized she was too old and too broke to start over in a cheap apartment building. The survival instinct of a cornered animal began to override her maternal devotion. Self-preservation is a powerful, ugly force. Richard stared at the blue legal binder resting on the table. He reached out with a trembling hand and traced the edge of the paper. He understood the profound irony of the situation. 10 years ago, he chose Payton and banished me. He locked the door without a second thought. Today, I was forcing him to reverse that exact decision to save his own life. The universe demanded balance, and I was the instrument delivering the scales. Payton sensed the shift in the room. She realized her parents were actually contemplating the offer. Her safety net was vanishing before her eyes. She dropped her designer bag onto the rug and rushed over to the recliner. She grabbed Richard's shoulder and shook him. She demanded he tear up the contracts. She screamed that they were a family and they had to stick together against me. She ordered him to throw me out of the house just like he did before. She played her final, desperate hand. She tried to summon the ghost of his old authority, but the authority was gone. The bank accounts were empty. The illusion was dead. Richard did not rise from the chair. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice. He just stared at the legal documents sitting on the coffee table. I pulled a silver fountain pen from my blazer pocket. I uncapped the polished metal cylinder and placed it directly on top of the signature line. I told Richard he had exactly 2 minutes to make his decision. If the ink was not drying on the paper when the timer expired, I would pack up the briefcase and instruct the sheriff to proceed with the eviction. I checked the platinum watch on my wrist. The ticking seconds filled the heavy silence of the room. The trap had successfully closed. The silver pen rested on the crisp white paper. The seconds ticked away on my platinum wristwatch. The rhythmic clicking filled the stagnant air of the living room. Payton stared at the pen. She looked at our father. The realization that he was actually considering my offer hit her like a physical strike. Her safety net was fraying. The limitless bank account she had exploited for her entire adult life was about to be permanently sealed. She could not handle the rejection. Payton paced across the stained area rug. Her beige trench coat flared behind her. She began a frantic, desperate monologue. She told Richard he was being ridiculous. She claimed my legal documents were just a bluff. She insisted I would never actually call the county sheriff to execute a foreclosure. She demanded he stand up and throw me out of the house. She tried to summon the ghost of his past authority. She reminded him that she was his true priority. She used the word family over and over again. She wielded it like a shield, hoping it would deflect the undeniable proof of her crimes. Richard did not look at her. His eyes remained locked on the signature line. Susan remained curled on the floorboards near the sofa. My mother had spent 10 years defending her eldest daughter against any perceived slight. She had alienated neighbors and ruined friendships to protect the illusion of her perfect child. But the forensic accounting report resting on the coffee table destroyed that illusion. Susan could not look at Payton. The glamorous internet influencer standing in her living room was a stranger. She was a predator who had drained their retirement funds and filed for bankruptcy to leave them holding the debt. Susan covered her face with her trembling hands and wept silently. The timer on my watch crossed the 1-minute mark. I sat perfectly still in the armchair. I did not utter a single word of encouragement or pressure. I allowed the heavy silence to break them. Richard reached forward. His weathered hand shook as his fingers wrapped around the polished metal cylinder of the fountain pen. He picked it up. Payton let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. She stomped her designer heel against the floorboards. She ordered him to BGK pen down. She screamed that signing the document meant he was choosing a treacherous runaway over his loyal daughter. She hurled insults at him, calling him a coward and a failure. Her voice cracked with genuine panic. My father did not argue. He did not defend his wounded pride. The man who once ruled our household with an iron fist had finally reached the end of his delusions. He unscrewed the silver cap. He pressed the metal nib against the thick bonded paper. The ink flowed dark and permanent. He signed his full legal name on the first designated line. He slid the contract across the wooden table toward Susan. My mother kept her eyes averted. She did not bother to read the dense legal clauses. She simply gripped the pen and scrawled her signature next to his. The transaction was complete. The irrevocable trust was activated. They had officially surrendered their ownership to secure their physical survival. I reached across the table and retrieved the documents. I slid them safely into my structured leather tote bag. The trap was sealed. Richard slowly capped the silver pen. He set it down. He placed both hands on the armrests of his faded recliner. He pushed himself up. His knees popped in the quiet room. He stood to his full height. The defeated slump vanished from his shoulders for a brief, fleeting moment. He turned to face Payton. Payton crossed her arms over her chest. She jutted her chin forward, attempting to maintain her defiant posture. She told him he made a terrible mistake. She claimed she was going to pack a weekend bag and stay at a luxury hotel until he came to his senses. She tried to frame her upcoming departure as a temporary punishment for his disobedience. Richard lifted his right arm. He extended a rigid finger toward the front entryway. He spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, but carried the weight of a crushing, undeniable truth. He told her to get out. Payton blinked. Her defiant expression faltered. She let out a nervous, hollow laugh. She asked him what he meant. My father took a step forward. The quiet whisper evaporated. The booming, authoritative voice of my childhood returned, fueled by a decade of betrayal and profound grief. He shouted at her to get out of his house. He told her she had taken everything he owned. He listed the second mortgage, the drained pension, and the ruined credit score. He told her he was broke and humiliated because he trusted a thief. He stated that the legal contract forbade her from remaining on the premises. He ordered her to walk upstairs, pack whatever she could fit into her expensive bags, and leave his property forever. The reality of her banishment crashed into Payton. The golden child was officially exiled. She looked at Susan, hoping for an intervention. Susan just turned her face away and stared at the peeling wallpaper. Payton realized she had lost. The audience was gone. The funding was cut. She spun around on her high heels. She marched down the hallway and stomped up the carpeted staircase. The heavy thud of her footsteps echoed through the ceiling. For the next 10 minutes, the house was filled with the chaotic sounds of her frantic retreat. Drawers slammed shut, closet doors banged against the drywall, hangers scraped harshly against metal racks. Richard stood in the center of the living room. He stared straight ahead at nothing in particular. The silence between us stretched tight. He had just executed the hardest decision of his life. He chose the bitter reality of survival over the beautiful, comfortable lie he had nurtured for 30 years. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Payton descended, dragging a large leather suitcase behind her. The wheels clattered loudly against the wooden steps. She carried an overflowing designer duffel bag over her shoulder. She struggled under the weight of her own luxury goods. She reached the bottom of the staircase and paused in the foyer. She looked into the living room one final time. She ignored our parents. Her eyes locked directly onto me. I remained seated comfortably in the armchair. My posture was relaxed. My hands rested gently in my lap. I was the architect of her downfall, and she knew it. Payton sneered. She opened her mouth to hurl a final venomous insult. She wanted to deliver a parting shot that would somehow wound my pride or diminish my victory. I simply raised my eyebrows and waited. She closed her mouth. She had nothing left in her arsenal. The forensic accounting report had stripped her of every defense. She gripped the handle of her heavy suitcase. She turned her back on her family and yanked the heavy oak front door open. She dragged her luggage over the threshold and stepped out onto the concrete porch. The door slammed shut behind her. I stood up from the armchair. I did not speak to Richard or Susan. I walked over to the large bay window overlooking the front yard. I reached out and pulled the dusty curtain aside. I watched Payton navigate the cracked concrete steps. Her high heels wobbled on the uneven pavement. She struggled to lift the heavy leather suitcase into the trunk of her luxury rental car. The autumn wind whipped her blonde hair across her face. She looked frantic and entirely alone. 10 years ago, I stood on that exact patch of freezing wet grass. I clutched my pregnant stomach and looked up at the second-story window. Payton had stood behind the glass, radiating pure triumph. She had smiled a cold, victorious smile and offered me a mocking little wave goodbye. I stood behind the glass now. I watched her slam the trunk of her car. She looked up at the bay window and saw me watching her. I did not smile. I did not raise my hand to wave. I did not feel the sudden rush of vindictive joy I once thought this moment would bring. I simply stared at her with a calm, steady gaze. The burning rage that had fueled my grueling night shifts and my endless hours of corporate analysis quietly extinguished itself. In its place, I felt a profound, hollow closure. Payton broke eye contact first. She climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The vehicle reversed out of the driveway and sped down the suburban street, disappearing around the corner. The cycle of abuse was officially severed. I dropped the dusty curtain, letting it fall back into place. I turned away from the glass. I had reclaimed complete control over the narrative and the physical ground where I was once exiled. There was only one thing left to do. It was time to leave this decaying museum of regret and return to the beautiful, impenetrable fortress I had built for myself. I turned away from the bay window and walked back to the scuffed wooden coffee table. The heavy forensic accounting report remained resting on the surface. I reached down and picked up my structured leather tote bag. The sharp metallic zip echoed through the stagnant air of the living room. The sound signaled the official end of the transaction. The business was concluded. The trap was permanently sealed. Richard remained sitting in his faded recliner. He stared at the blank television screen, holding the blue legal folder in his lap. He looked like a hollow shell. Susan realized I was preparing to depart. Panic flared in her red, swollen eyes. She scrambled to her feet. She wiped her wet cheeks with the sleeve of her worn fleece robe. She took a tentative step toward the foyer, but stopped well outside my personal space. She knew better than to attempt physical contact again. Susan asked me to wait. Her voice trembled. She begged for a way to reach me. She asked for a cell phone number or an email address. She claimed she just wanted to know I was safe. She pleaded for a single photograph of her granddaughter. She promised she would not interfere with my life. She swore she just wanted a tiny piece of her real family back. I paused in the entryway. I looked over my shoulder at the woman who gave birth to me. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt a profound, icy detachment. I informed Susan that she did not have a real family. I stated that she significantly surrendered her family the night she locked the heavy oak door and left a pregnant teenager in the freezing rain. I told her the legal firm managing the irrevocable trust would handle all future correspondence regarding the property taxes and utility bills. I clarified that my attorneys would monitor the residency covenant to ensure Payton never set foot on the premises. I instructed her to direct any maintenance requests to the corporate paralegals. I made it undeniably clear that our relationship was strictly a landlord and tenant arrangement. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open and stepped out onto the concrete porch. I did not look back. I walked down the cracked steps and crossed the uneven pavement of the driveway. I unlocked my silver luxury vehicle. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the heavy car door, shutting out the crisp autumn wind. I pressed the ignition button. The expensive engine purred to life with a smooth, powerful hum. I shifted the gear into reverse and backed out onto the suburban street. I shifted into drive and pressed my foot against the accelerator. I navigated the familiar winding roads of my youth. I drove past the local parks where I used to hide and read paperback novels. I passed the high school where my fight for survival began in a sterile nurse's office. With every mile marker that faded in my rearview mirror, a heavy, suffocating weight lifted from my shoulders. For 10 years, I carried a dense knot of trauma deep inside my chest. I spent a decade anticipating a phantom threat from people who held zero actual power over my destiny. As I merged onto the interstate highway, the tension dissolved into the cool, conditioned air of the car cabin. I breathed a deep, even breath. I felt incredibly free. The ghosts of my past were officially evicted from my mind. They were trapped in a decaying house governed by my strict rules, while I was driving toward a limitless horizon. The highway transition took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into an entirely different universe. I pulled into the smooth, paved driveway of my own home. The manicured green lawn glowed under the warm afternoon sun. The tall oak trees framing my property stood strong and protective. I parked the vehicle in my spacious garage. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked through the interior door into my pristine, modern kitchen. The house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh herbs. Soft instrumental music played from a wireless speaker on the granite countertop. I set my bag down and looked toward the large island in the center of the room. Mrs. Gallagher sat on a tall wooden stool. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, even on a casual weekend afternoon. She leaned over a scattered pile of textbook pages and notebook paper. Sitting right next to her was my 10-year-old daughter. Mia held a yellow pencil in her small hand. She furrowed her brow, concentrating intensely on a complex, long division problem. Mrs. Gallagher pointed a rigid finger at the numerator on the page. She spoke in the exact same fierce, no-nonsense tone she used when she rescued me from the school clinic a decade ago. She demanded excellence from Mia and accepted zero excuses. Mia calculated the numbers and wrote down the correct answer. Mrs. Gallagher offered a rare, genuine smile and patted my daughter's shoulder. Mia looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. Her face lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. She dropped her yellow pencil and ran across the kitchen floor. She wrapped her arms around my waist and squeezed tight. I knelt down and hugged her back. I buried my face in her soft hair. She felt safe. She felt secure. The fortress I built around her was flawless. I looked up at Mrs. Gallagher. The older woman met my gaze with sharp, discerning eyes. She did not ask me how the meeting went. She did not need a verbal report. She saw the quiet, triumphant peace settling across my features. She gave me a single, solemn nod. It was the nod of a general acknowledging a hard-won battlefield victory. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen island. I realized in that warm, bright room that biology is nothing more than a random genetic lottery. Blood does not create a family. A shared last name does not guarantee loyalty. True family is forged through consistency. It is built on unwavering protection. It is a deliberate, conscious choice. My biological parents chose to protect a liar. They chose to fund a sociopathic thief who ultimately led them to financial ruin. They abandoned their duties the moment the truth became inconvenient. Mrs. Gallagher chose to open her spare bedroom to a starving, pregnant teenager. She chose to sit in sterile waiting DDK rooms during my prenatal appointments. She chose to teach me how to fight back using the law. She showed up every single day for 10 years. She earned the title of grandmother through sheer grit and undeniable devotion. She was my real mother in every metric that actually mattered. I spent my early 20s believing I had to prove my worth to the people who erased me. I thought success was a weapon designed to inflict pain on those who caused my suffering. I realize today that success is not a weapon. It is a shield. It is the architecture you build to ensure toxic people can never reach you again. I did not ruin Richard and Susan. I simply purchased their debt and handed them a mirror. I forced them to live inside the exact reality they created for themselves. I stripped them of their golden child and left them with the cold, hard truth. They are safe from the elements, but they will spend the rest of their days knowing their discarded daughter holds the keys to their survival. People often ask me if I harbor any lingering resentment toward my past. They wonder if I feel guilty for imposing such strict, unforgiving terms on my own flesh and blood. The answer is a resounding no. I reclaimed my narrative. I secured my future. I protected my child. The storm that almost destroyed me became the exact catalyst for my empire. If you are listening to this story right now and you are trapped in a toxic cycle with the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, please hear me clearly. You do not owe your abusers a front row seat to your healing. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep manipulative people warm. Forgiveness doesn't mean access. You can forgive someone for your peace and still lock the door. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that subscribe button right now. Your support helps these narratives reach the people who need them the most. Drop a comment below and share your own boundary-setting stories. I read every single one. Remember that you define your own worth. Take care of yourself and your chosen family. I will see you in the next story. When we deeply examine the tragic, fractured dynamics of a family torn apart by a crisis, specifically the devastating moment a terrified 16-year-old girl discovers she is pregnant and is subsequently cast out into the freezing, relentless rain by the very people who were fundamentally supposed to protect her, we are forcefully compelled to confront the harsh, uncomfortable reality that conditional love, bound entirely by rigid expectations and a desperate, suffocating need to preserve a superficial family image, inflicts long-lasting, irreversible psychological damage that completely severs the familial bond, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that if a child feels they must constantly earn your love, respect, and approval through flawless behavior and unwavering obedience, you have already lost them forever. And this tragedy is profoundly compounded by the fact that a teenage pregnancy at the fragile age of 16 is not merely a simple mistake, a rebellious phase, or a brief lapse in judgment, but rather a massive, life-altering crisis, a terrifying and isolating crossroads where children are in desperate need of their parents the most, meaning that deliberately driving a child out of their home during their most vulnerable, frightened hour is tantamount to actively pushing them directly into the harrowing, unforgiving risks of poverty, systemic exploitation, physical violence, and absolute failure, thereby representing a complete and total abandonment of the fundamental protective role that parents are inherently and morally obligated to fulfill, serving as a stark, unforgettable reminder that your child's absolute worst mistake should never, under any conceivable circumstances, cost them their only safe place in the world. Furthermore, the extreme, visceral reactions so often exhibited by parents in these high-stakes situations, such as violently throwing their child's fragile, meager belongings onto the wet front lawn, publicly disowning them, and immediately changing the locks on the heavy oak doors, do not stem from a place of genuine education, moral guidance, or parental discipline, but rather from a deep-seated, paralyzing fear of social judgment and a toxic, narcissistic compulsion to impose a flawless societal facade upon their household, which, especially within the context of modern American culture, where individual growth and psychological well-being are highly valued, is widely recognized as a highly toxic, destructive parenting paradigm, reinforcing the crucial, enduring lesson that raising a child is never about ruthlessly controlling their choices or shaming them into terrified submission, but rather about patiently, safely, and compassionately guiding them through the natural consequences of their actions. Because when parents choose to wield control and shame over empathy and understanding, the inevitable consequence of deliberately cutting off contact for a decade is a devastating bilateral loss, wherein the parents not only inflict severe trauma upon their offspring, but also permanently forfeit their own precious opportunity to become grandparents, losing the sacred, irreplaceable right to witness their child's growth, their quiet victories, and their incredible, hard-won transformation into a resilient, independent adult, ultimately culminating in a bitter, hollow, and suffocating regret when that banished child returns years later, cloaked in undeniable success, heavily emphasizing the heartbreaking truth that stubborn pride can, and will, cost you a decade you will never, ever get back. Yet, turning our perspective away from the failure of the parents and toward the young adults navigating the harsh, competitive realities of the United States, this brutal narrative offers a profound, luminous beacon of hope, illustrating that while a pregnancy at 16 is so often stigmatized and considered by a judgmental society to be the absolute end of the road, a catastrophic, life-ruining failure from which one can never truly recover, the empowering reality is that one single mistake does not decide your entire life, but rather what you deliberately, courageously choose to do in the immediate, terrifying aftermath of that devastation is what ultimately shapes your destiny. For when you are abruptly stripped of your safety net and exiled from the only home you have ever known, self-reliance ceases to be merely an admirable personality trait and instantly transforms into a vital, uncompromising, and absolute survival skill, forcing the young discarded mother to earn a living for herself in the darkest hours of the night, raise her own child in the shadows of society, and meticulously rebuild her shattered life from the ground up. A grueling, exhausting journey that perfectly aligns with the deeply ingrained American cultural values of sheer resilience and self-made success, proving that the human spirit can forge an impenetrable armor out of absolute despair. And as she climbs the arduous, cutthroat ladder of high finance and personal autonomy, she discovers the empowering, liberating reality that true success is never truly about enacting petty, vindictive revenge against those who wronged her, which is exactly why the symbolic, cinematic detail of her pulling into her parents' cracked, weed-choked driveway in a luxury car they could never possibly afford is not merely a shallow display of accumulated wealth, but rather a profound, undeniable declaration of restored personal honor, reinforcing the empowering message that massive, undeniable success is the loudest, most definitive answer you can ever provide, effectively meaning that you never need to waste your breath arguing, screaming, or defending your worth to people who actively chose to misunderstand you. Which ultimately brings us to the complex psychological crossroads of healing versus revenge, illustrating that the climactic moment of knocking on that childhood door opens two distinct, diverging paths, one leaning toward traditional forgiveness and emotional reconciliation, and the other leaning toward direct confrontation and clinical, boundary-driven closure, an emotional duality that resonates deeply with modern audiences who are fiercely focused on mental health, trauma recovery, and the absolute validity of emotional boundaries, teaching us that you can absolutely choose the path of closure without ever exposing yourself to further abuse. Forgiving someone entirely in your own heart for the sake of your own internal peace, while simultaneously making the empowering, unapologetic choice to keep the deadbolt locked and deny them access to the beautiful, secure life you have built from the ashes of their betrayal. If this deeply emotional exploration of generational trauma, relentless resilience, and the undeniable, terrifying power of walking away has touched a raw nerve or mirrored your own silent battles with toxic family dynamics, please take a moment to join our growing community. Subscribe to the channel and share your own incredible, hard-fought, boundary-setting stories in the comments below here at Sophia Told Stories, leaving us to look out into the quiet, fading light of our own lives, wondering if the impenetrable, towering walls we have so carefully constructed to protect our fragile hearts from the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally, are magnificent monuments to our undeniable strength, or simply the beautiful, quiet tombs of the childhoods we were never allowed to have. As we trace the invisible scars of our independence and realize, with a sudden, breathless ache, that the most profound peace often feels exactly like standing completely alone in a room you finally own.